be fair. And I still think a lot of people have a really misconstrued notion about what pain means and what it can potentially mean to them as far as a part of their identity, right? So I was hoping maybe you could, what's the word we're going to use here? Highlight some of these misconceptions that people typically have, and then kind of shine some light on some new nuances onto where we can go from explaining pain to people.
Yeah. So when we start looking at the discussion around pain, people have a very personalized experience with this. So like people tend to develop kind of in a prolonged pain state, people begin to identify with pain, right? So like it's very difficult for an individual to come in and show us pain, right? Because that's not really a thing. I can't look at you and say that is pain. You have pain in this location. We can identify things that are aberrant in movement patterns. We can identify things that aren't going the way we expect them to. We can see an upregulated nervous system, for certain physical attributes, but we cannot create a tactile experience to pain to be able to quantify it in any reasonable way. And for years, physicians and researchers have created different little pain scales to kind of identify this stuff. But like the reality is that pain is an individualized experience, whatever that may be, however that is expressed for you. We can quantify certain factors about it, but pain becomes this really prolific experience for the individual that has been dealing with it for a long time, because we cannot, as practitioners, see it, feel it, touch it, truly interact with it. People can kind of get pushed down the road to a certain extent. So like there's a lot of times we get stories from people who've been to the menagerie of practitioners, and even to the point where people are like, well, this is just kind of in your head, which is somewhat true, right? Because pain is an experience of the brain, but I think that people tend to latch on really tight to that pain experience, especially after an extended period of time, because I think that due to the difficulty in quantifying what pain is, the individual will then start to resonate with that experience to the point that they want you to know what they're dealing with. They want you to know how they feel. I've always said that like one of my big red flag markers whenever I'm interviewing somebody is when they come right out like first thing and tell me, this is the worst pain of my life and I take pain well. Like that's the first thing that like, I'm like, okay, so what you're saying to me is that you're really having a lot of pain, because a lot of times I feel like that's a statement that gets said when someone has been blown off or kind of pushed to the side a little bit, because they're wanting you to know that I tolerate pain and this is the worst thing I've felt. And I think a lot of practitioners tend to kind of blow that off a little bit. So that's a big red flag marker for me to kind of pay attention to, and that I need to respect that this individual is experiencing something, significant to them.
And what do you think the source? What do you think the source of that is? Like somebody come in and say, "Hey, I typically deal with pain really well, but this is the worst pain in my life." Does that have something to do with ego, potentially, and or like differences between masculine and feminine energies there? Because some of this could be based off of, and my perception of this, and perspective of it could be based off of how people were raised. And there's all these social constructs around, hey, men shouldn't cry, men shouldn't feel pain. So when they do finally muster up enough courage to seek help, like coming to you, it's almost like we put up this barrier, we put up this resistance to it from the get-go in an effort to try and show how tough we are. But could that potentially, and this is kind of a second question, could that potentially be detrimental to recovering from that pain experience?
So yes. I think what you're kind of alluding to is the sociological aspect of pain, right? So you and I have discussed this many, many times. I feel like it's very well known within the community now, like the idea of the biopsychosocial approach to pain. I think that the social isn't very well understood, and I do think that that's kind of pointing at that, at least to some extent. Not 100% of the time, because just like anything else, nothing is ever 100%. But I would definitely agree with that. When you have an identity that is wrapped up in like, I'm a tough guy, I handle this stuff really well, like I'm known for being able to handle this pain, and you're experiencing something that is debilitating, limiting, however you want to label it, that definitely is going to have a resonance to your ego, right? Like to be able to say like, I'm dealing with this, I really want help, but I still need you to know that I am, I'm a tough guy, and that's how bad this is. I think that maybe twofold to answer your second question on that. Once we get wrapped into that identity, as soon as somebody starts to buy into the nature of, I have pain, this is who I am. Anytime we start to tie our self-worth into that, that becomes very difficult, because now we've added a layer of complexity into that person's social story, right? So they've now created this frame of reference for themselves as individual with pain. And what I mean by that is that a lot of the time people will use those frames of reference for why they can't do something. And so whatever that may be, maybe it was like something I used to do, or I wanted to do, or maybe, compared to your peers, I'm not as good at. A lot of the times people will use that pain experience as a means of saying, I could have done that, but because of this, I can't. And I think that that is more detrimental as a mindset than any true physiological issue. I mean, think about the menagerie of stuff you and I have seen. Like, we've seen some weird things, right? To the point where if everything came down to just physiology, just, this tissue is damaged, therefore we do this and this will be fixed, our jobs would be done by a textbook or Google search, right? Because it would be super, super easy. The thing that adds the layers of oddity and complexity and difficulty into what we do is being able to break down that story, that relationship that somebody has created to this event, and being able to change that so that they can then express, movement in a capacity that is relatively pain-free.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and what I hear you saying there is that we can use this story that they've developed in their head and kind of reframe it and help them reframe it on their own to start to shift the perspective of it. Because in a sense, that story that we keep telling ourselves, whether that be true or false, it becomes our reality, right?
Yeah.
The story, that perception becomes our reality. And we know a lot of this from Joe Dispenza's work, where he looks at the whole belief system that you have around pain, you have around your body's capabilities, and physicality and movement capabilities as well, to where you start shifting the chemical and hormonal processes inside the body, and then that will physically manifest itself in a couple different ways, or a few different ways, right? For somebody who is in chronic pain, it starts to continue that cycle, right? And it makes that sensitivity worse, because that's what you believe, that's the bar you set for yourself. That's where you believe your limit, and you can't get past that. So the brain will be like, okay, cool, we're going to make sure that that is actually the case, versus taking that story, turning it on its head, and helping them look at it from a different viewpoint, to where you can now put a more positive spin on it, one that is more hopeful in nature, that allows you to actually work through that situation, right? So I look at this from a number of years ago when I tore the meniscus in my left knee. I was on a trip with the Olympics. I tore it getting into a passenger van, and I didn't say a damn thing to anybody when it happened. Like, it sucked, right? But then that was the ego part of me of like, hey, I can't be that guy, right? So I sat there in the passenger van, and my leg like kind of elevated up on my PT table, PT bag, and I watched like the swelling push out into my skinny jeans. And there was like this identity crisis like flooding my brain all at the same time. And those questions, they do pop into your head of like, whoa, shit, what am I going to do now? Am I going to be able to move? Am I going to be able to exercise? Am I going to lose my six packs? Is my girlfriend going to love me? And how could I be that PT movement guy that tears the fucking meniscus getting in and out of a passenger van of all things? Like, and it happens so fast.
Yep.
So you can see how that cycle spirals down quickly, right?
Yep. Yep.
And it was in that moment then where I tried to shift it on its head, because I was feeling very, very down about myself. You could feel like the depression set in. It's like, okay, well, how can I use this for a greater good? What can I learn about myself right now? So we start shifting the questions that we're asking. Okay. What was limited in my movement literacy that I can now work on? How is this then going to help me help myself so I can help others afterwards? And it becomes more of a question, like I said, of hope and desire. And it's energetic in nature to the point where it's almost motivating, right? And become devoted to the cause of what could be rather than what is in that moment.
You know, man, like, and it's interesting kind of like thinking about it as you're talking about this, because there was the research that came out. We used to frame pain and injury around the idea of acute, subacute, and chronic, right? And the idea that injuries became chronic after X amount of time. The thing that's fascinating, and we go over this so much, especially within our course that we've developed, but the idea that the brain is so neurologically plastic and adaptable that following an acute injury, something that happens right now, they show chronic changes to the brain within minutes, because that plasticity sets in. And like, there's so much opportunity to change that and to deal with that. Because if you think about it from the standpoint of, if we show those chronic changes rapidly, meaning kind of loss of some perception of self, loss of positional sense, things of that nature around a joint or a tissue, if it can change that quickly, it can also change back that quickly. And so we have this ability to work within the plastic nature of the mindset that will do that. And if it happens that fast, it also means that it is not tissue related, right? It has to be something that is chemical or super physiological from the standpoint of that neurological sense of self. And that is those are the things that we can integrate with so rapidly. And so much management from the PT side when it comes to pain is creating the awareness, understanding that individual's story and relationship to this thing, and then figuring out how can you best interrelate with that individual to help them through the narrative to go from, being in that scenario of chronic injury, pain, that cycle, and being able to break free of that so that they can become the hero of their own story, right? Like, so allowing them to actually take ownership of this thing and push that forward, push that beyond. And then that also allows for those neurophysiological changes to occur both in the brain, so that we can then recognize our body positional sense again, down regulate that central nervous system so that our threshold for pain then is returned back to our normal levels rather than being so reduced. Because I think, I don't know, man, kind of coming off the cuff, I guess, but like, instead of thinking about the threshold for pain being reduced, is that our background pain is now actually being elevated, right? Because we're so focused on it. It's no longer a lowering of the threshold. We are so upregulated that even the smallest thing can throw us off. And if we can interact in such a way to down-regulate that system, we have now become much more proficient for that individual to allow them to express movement. Because the more that they can move in a relatively pain-free state, the more they're going to tolerate moving. And so that is the positive loop, or that positive feedback loop, that we want to establish and create for this individual, rather than, the cycle of like, well, how bad your pain today, right? Like, how many times did we hear that whenever you worked in the outpatient setting, right? Mm-hmm. Give me your pain from 0 to 10 today. Oh, is it really a 10? Is it really that bad? Like, yeah, man. I mean, if they said it is. Like, so what?
it is a personal experience, right? So then we're passing shame and judgment on that individual. We're like, are you really a 9 out of 10? And how do you think that that's
Yeah.
then affecting that individual, right? It's not going to feel great about themselves, but then they're also going to be maybe consciously or unconsciously like, who is this fucking guy to judge me right now? You know what I mean? And then we're going
Yep.
to lose trust in that
Yep.
individual. So what I
Or
think you're
never gain
speaking
it to
to,
begin with, right?
or never
Never
gain to begin with.
establish it. Yeah.
Yeah. And
And
I
the,
can't even tell you the last time I actually even asked that question.
yeah, I don't bother
Then
anymore. I have
never,
people, it was
never.
always interesting to me, the people who volunteer it. That's an interesting one to me, because there are those people.
They've been conditioned.
They believe that it is necessary to know. And I mean, I always take it in. Like, I've never made a comment about it, because this is part of the story you want to tell me today. This is part of the narrative that you want to carry. So, okay, cool. Like, that's great. How else is everything? Like, what else is going on with this? What were you able to do, this week or this month or whatever it is, kind of reframing it. And it's almost the inevitable that when you're able to carry that narrative and say, like, okay, I respect what you're saying to me. I'm taking it in. I hear you. I repeat it back to you so that you know that I heard it. And then let's talk about you. Let's talk about what else is going on around this now. It oftentimes creates a much greater expression, and it's really interesting to be able to carry those conversations forward. Or if it's not going the way that we want it to, right, it allows us a window of, okay, what else is happening within this person or their nervous system or their environment that we're not seeing clear enough to be able to make these interventions as effective as we think they should be. So then we can change strategy or change conversation or give reason to maintain.
And are those interventions then, does it even come down to the movement selection that we choose as far as whether or not those interventions are going to be effective? Likely not, right? It's going to come down to their belief system in us and their confidence in us to help them get better. Our job as clinicians is not to tell somebody what to do or to fix them. Our job and responsibility is just to shift that locus of control to something that's more internal and provide the confidence that they can get better. And I joke around people all the time. I tell this to everyone, that I could be the worst PT out there, but I do such a great job at connecting with people that I could literally tell them to go do fucking clamshells and they'd get better. Right. Sure. Because it's not really about the intervention most of the time. It's how well that they believe in us to help guide them down this path to recovery. And you start to see then, and we can kind of bring in the neurological and the biological into this as well, where you start to see that internal confidence start to shift that neuroplasticity that you were talking about, right? You start to get this rewiring, create more neuromuscular efficiency and their confidence in maybe the novelty of the movement patterns that we're giving them. But then over time, I believe you start to see this shift into the more of that bioplasticity realm, right? Where we do have these adaptations physically with movement. And I think a lot of that has to do with, you talked about the brain and thresholds and everything. And, I believe that, the brain has a map of every single part of our body. It has a picture of every single part of our body. And when we are experiencing pain, the longer that carries on, the, I guess, more distorted and fuzzy and cloudy that picture or that map becomes. So confidence does a really great job of instilling more motivation to move, which then helps to make that picture a lot clearer. And when that picture becomes clearer and sharper and it's more in focus, all those sensory signals, those threat defensive signals, they start to calm down, right? Because now the brain has a great understanding about where that body part is at in space and how to use it. Confidence start to grows. And that's where then we can shift this more into that bioplasticity, where we start to see the physical adaptations start to change within the body, right? And these physical adaptations, I think, then are also what help that person stay motivated, because not only are they feeling it, but they're also seeing it maybe in the amount of weight that they're moving, or how much cleaner and maybe more symmetrical or smoother and more efficient their movement patterns not only feel but also look on video. And so I think that both are really, really important. It's why that we try and tie all the neurological, all the pain science into the physical, the biological as well in this course that we wrote, because they're both vitally important. It's what we need to utilize as this holistic, well-rounded system to really work on the health and longevity of the organism for the long term, right? That's the key. Is we're not about this short term, can we take your pain away fix. Plenty of PTs are great at doing that, right?
Sure.
It's a dime a dozen. And I won't get into this now, but I'm a firm believer that some of us maybe need to sit with that pain a little bit longer. We actually need to feel into it and experience it. And if we take it away too quickly, I think we're actually doing that person a disservice as well. But it's one of those things where it comes back to the point that it's a relationship that we built. And we built that relationship based off of those communication strategies, and then also the confidence to help guide them down that path of recovery that's going to matter in the long term.
Let's take 2 minutes, because I really want to chew on that a little bit more. The idea of somebody having to sit with the experience of pain. I think I want you to clarify it a little bit further, but from my perspective, the thing I'd want to tell people about that, because that might seem like an odd statement coming from physical therapists, right? Because we're like, well, we got to get rid of pain. Pain's bad. Pain is a natural phenomenon that happens in your body. And it is not a normal existence to not have a pain experience. And I think that for a healthy body and healthy system, we need to understand that pain. And that might mean you need to experience it to a greater extent, to a greater time frame, and learn your nervous system from that standpoint, because how you react to various things will inherently be it will be changed by that pain experience. And I think that's a good thing at times, as long as it is well controlled and reasonable. I think it is good for people to experience some of that and not try to hide away from it.
Yeah. And like you alluded to, and I'm going to answer this question as succinctly as I can, which we know is problematic for both of us.
30-minute presentation, no problem.
No, we got this. It's one of those things where I view it as more of a learning experience, right? Yeah. It's happening for a reason. So when we jump to things like medication or injections or surgeries, or even the modalities that a lot of physical therapists like to employ, like the cupping and the dry needling and the manipulations, which we all do on occasion, there's a time and a place for them. But I think what ends up happening is we remove it too quickly sometimes, where we haven't given that individual the opportunity to learn what it can from that pain experience, right? So it's almost to me like this opportunity to explore more. Okay, so like let's just say I've got one-sided low back pain. What are some movement patterns that feel good? What are some movement patterns that don't feel good, right? You start to learn how to solve the puzzle and triage the pain experience on your own, which in and of itself is also a confidence builder, like saying, hey, okay, I know this feels good. Maybe this is not that great, but I can move into it and it's not causing me any more distress.
That's the one right there, man. To me, at least, like that, okay, this hurts, but I'm not going over the baseline hurt. And I can continue to do. So I can do almost as much, if not as much, as what I normally would on, whatever given activity, but my pain threshold doesn't change. So I can survive through this. And even in the worst case scenario, I can continue on just as is if I really want to.